Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the two new sets from CCA. So this is the CCA CXS and this is the CCA HM20. So I will refer to this one as Mr. Over and this is Mr. Under, and we'll get into that in a bit. But for now, let's kind of start with the exterior, and the obvious, attraction to the CSX set is going to be this beautiful metal shell, and CCA would describe it as jewelry quality. It's been put together, polished, electroplated. It is super nice. It is weighty. It's thick. Very much not like the previous. I think ZES was the previous close to metal shell, or even PR1. Those are really nothing compared to the build quality on this guy. Second thing to notice on the exterior is that little vent right there. So this one is open back as well. And the hole actually just goes all the way through. So that's a literally hole through it. On the HM20, the most notable thing is it is open back as well, so that back is not a decorative, that is actually a real vent. The rest of it is kind of hidden behind a very dark shell, but really what stands HM20 apart from the other previous sets and the other flagship sets are the 3D duct that's in there and the new 7mm dynamic driver. So you can't really see either one of those through this dark shell, but that is sort of the standout features of it. Secondly is really the size, and it's really hard to get it when you look at it just at pictures, how small the HM20 actually is. And those of you who have the AS16 Pro will realize that this one was actually sort of a larger shell, but the HM20 is super small for a 7+1 flagship. So that's what we got there. Other thing on the interior of CSX, they do have, this is the legendary new 10mm driver. And I'll say it's actually a really good dynamic driver. I'm not sure it's legendary yet, but I think it actually does feature two real key advantages that CCA talks about. And it's the magnetic gap, which is super, super small, and the thick voice coil. So the gap gives you lower distortion, and the thicker voice coil gives you new bass. So that is what they would call out. The marketing guy would say that is what's new on this new XUN7 driver, which is a 7mm driver. So this one does feature I think it's actually a 10mm driver, but this one is a 1+7, so that's a 1 dynamic driver and 7 BAs, and you can't really see any of them through the shell. So that's what we got on the exteriors. So let's kind of dive into what they look like on the graph. And it's kind of an interesting setup what they did here. And KZ will talk about the legendary driver here on 10mm, and this is the new 7mm driver. And again, they sort of gave us more of a V shape, and the CSX would be called more of a U shape. That's how they describe it. This is sort of more of a modified V shape, but you can kind of see KZ had this EDA balance set, which was super popular. Everyone liked it. It had a tuning that wasn't universal, but it was liked by lots and lots of people, and kind of this lower bass shelf in the red, and then this very easy lower pin gain, pop up at 5 to give you some details, and then trail off the treble in a nice kind of extended yet not fatiguing way. And then when we look at CSX, which is the guy in blue, this guy, so this was the legendary 10mm driver. And again, they sort of felt the need to give it a little more bass because it's got a thicker voice coil, so we must give it a little more bass to prove that it can do more bass without much distortion. And then we really raise the pin gain up quite a bit over where something that worked is, and it rises a little early and it rises kind of high. And it brings everything kind of forward and distracting, and kind of an interesting way to show off the new legendary driver with a little imbalance there. So then when we look at HM20, they added even more bass, because why not? Because it can do more bass, so give it more bass. Kind of a more relaxed rise here, but then no matter what was going to happen here, it was always going to be sort of behind this level of bass. And that's sort of where this one sounds like. And that's why I say that this is Mr. Over, because it has sort of a pin gain that's a little too high and a little too forward. The lower treble is very prominent and very forward. It's a bit too much, too forward, a bit too over. And what happens on HM20 is you get so much bass here that it really drags down this, and the treble actually sounds a little under, so that became Mr. Under. So let's kind of dive into a quick run through of what these guys look like on paper. So CSX, like I said, maybe we'll swap these so they are in the proper arrangement. So CSX, like I said, Mr. Over. This is the high energy one. It's got a lot of bass energy. It's got a lot of treble energy, a little bit over. This is HM20. This is the chill one. It's got a very relaxed treble, definitely Mr. Under. This one is U-shape, bright and bassy. So it's kind of a traditional U-shape. It's got a big bass and kind of a big treble, but it's more in a lower treble, but takes on more of that UV shape. This is a big, big bass set, but with a relaxed treble. So you end up with this really kind of lower bass dominant sound to it, but a relaxed treble, so it ends up being sort of centered in that bass area, as opposed to being, this one is U-shaped and you kind of have equal arms on the U, and this one is sort of just a bass, more of a maybe of an L. Major nitpick on CSX, a bit too treble forward, like I said. It gets a bit fatiguing after a bit, so not too much of a surprise there. That's why EDA balance was a popular set, because it didn't really have that problem. Major nitpick on HM20. So the mids and treble struggle over that bass, like I said. It just sounds a little veiled, a bit muted. It sounds like maybe a traditional V shape where the mids are really kind of recessed and set back a little bit because there's so much bass and it really dominates a lot of the sound. This one is the CXS, is the Legendary Driver, and I think it does deliver the great performance and dynamics. It actually does sound quite well. It just needs to be tweaked a little bit to be a little more balanced. The HM20, this is the first cut of this 3D printed duct system, and I think they actually pulled it off quite well. It's kind of an amazing way to do hybrids compared to, even something like this, which you look like this is actually how KZ was traditionally doing it. And they would print out that big white block and actually run all the BAs into that sound duct, is what they would call it. So now with HM20, you can't even see it, but they have individual ducts for the 3 parts. So there's a BA for the ultra high frequencies, and then there's a BA for sort of the mids and the high. Then there's a duct for the dynamic driver as well. So I think they did the 3D printed part quite well, but it really needs to sound a little more open, a little more detailed, and it just needs, the BAs need to be kind of brought into a little bit more forward, or maybe the bass needs to be brought down quite a bit. Either way, it needs a little more of the upper end, a little bit of that BA-ness, as I call it. So open back on either one of them. Kind of hard to figure out if that really had any advantage. I don't really hear it in the stage. I think these two in particular don't really do as well as other recent KZs in stage. So I will say that both of them have open back, but it's kind of hard to really hear where that would be an advantage. So the bass on CSX, like I said, this one is kind of a traditional, slightly above that KZ fun level. It's still controlled. Again, they put nice new Legendary Driver. It actually does its job. It's actually quite well, quite controlled, not too bloated. Considering that level, it actually sounds pretty good, and it does good body to the lower mids and helps balance the upper mids, but bassy tracks are going to sound very bassy. But with the rest of it, with that U-shape, it actually comes across as a little more detailed, and I think the better bass is actually the CSX. The bass on the HM20, it's still impactful like the CSX. It's just got that crazy level of bass, and the lowered upper mids, the whole thing kind of ends up muting, and there's not as much detail. I think part is that level is just way too high. The whole thing is a bit more bloated than it is on here, and you don't really have the upper end to give you any more detail to it or any texture to it. It kind of sounds a little more veiled in one note. So definitely the bass on I think I prefer the bass on the CSX, probably simply on the level, but it does come across as more detailed. So the mids, more dynamic, more forward, more detailed on CSX. Like I said, this is Mr. Over. It's a little bit too much. It's engaging in a V-shaped way. The driver is doing the job, but the upper mid attracts too much emphasis. It's just slightly off balance. It gives you part fatigue, part detracting from that treble. in part washing out the naturalness and texture of vocals. Just like Lyra, this signature is very much like Lyra. Lyra had the same exact problem. You just have a little too much energy coming off of the nozzle, and it just pulls everything up a little higher than it should be. It's just a hair too energetic for, but fine in short sessions is what I would call it. But over the long term, it actually comes across as a little more fatiguing, definitely a lot more fatiguing than this guy. So if you A/B these two and you switch over from CSX to CXS to HM20, this is about 2 notches down in energy from the CXS. I should probably stop saying that because it's too confusing. But this guy is super relaxed compared to the Mr. Over brother. This is very much a relaxed listen, and it really struggles. You really struggle to find those hybrid details. It's a 7+1 or a 1+7, and you're really expecting a good amount of details and resolution from those BAs. And it's just hard to find it with all that bass. It's going to mask and cover up and veil, big V shape. Lots of things are working against hearing all those details and resolution that should be coming through with the BAs. So there's just too much bass and really not enough upper treble to make it sound. The whole thing sounds a bit dull, a little less dynamic than it really should be. It's great for a long, non-fatiguing session, but for people who are looking for that hybrid advantage, it doesn't really come across all that easily on this set. So the mids, I think, are a tie. I think both of them. This, of course, is Mr. Over, and this one is a bit under, and somewhere in the middle would actually be a great set. So the treble on this guy, very much like Lyra, like I've been talking about, it really needs something on a new damper on the nozzle to just cut down the energy just a hair. It's just a lot, and after a while it gets to be really a lot, but that would really improve the balance from the lower treble all the way through the upper treble. And this one comes across kind of more like a traditional high energy V. Again, the driver is doing its job. It's actually really good, but it just needs a slight tweak to bring that energy down and to bring it more in balance so you could actually hear that treble extension without hearing all that lower treble emphasis, which blocks everything that this legendary driver should do in the upper treble and extension. All that really gets hidden behind too much energy, right around that 2 to 3K area. So the treble on HM20, it definitely struggles with the bass. I think no matter what they did to the treble, no matter how many BAs they threw at it, I think that level is just going to struggle with that amount of bass. It's a lot of bass. And for KZ, this is sort of a conservative treble level, not all that far from what they've used before. And you can actually hear it. It's not like it's hidden or too dark. It's always present. It's just not as uplifting as it should be. The CSX is lower heavy. And the HM20, it's just less consistent with so much bass. It's where CSX sort of has this peakiness at the lower treble. HM20 has some bright spots and then a lot of kind of dull spots, and in between it's very inconsistent. Sometimes it actually does sound like a very nice relaxed hybrid set, and sometimes it sounds too relaxed. There's just not enough energy there, and it sounds a little muted and dull. And I think they did take a really good shot at doing a really nice coherent dynamic driver BA hybrid set, but I think it just needed to tweak the BAs a little more so they're a little more present, a little more detail, a little more resolution, bring them forward just a little bit so you can actually hear some of this BA-ness come out and it sounds more like a traditional hybrid. So stage on the CXS, it's very wide. It kind of is definitely wide enough, but it's very close in. The way they rose a little too early, it's just kind of really in your face, and not enough height. And like I said, this thing has the back vent, but as far as giving you a stage with a lot of height, this one is kind of all wrong. It's kind of strange, considering how KZ has actually gotten that right on the past few sets. I think putting the back vent changed something about this set where they really lost some of their nice stage presence that they've had on some recent sets. HM20 is definitely closer to what KZ has been doing recently. This more relaxed presentation, not in your face. It has height. And this one is very much, closer to some of the stages that you've had on previous KZ sets. So definitely a winner in the stage. I would actually give CXS the winner on the treble, just because you could probably fix this pretty easily by putting something on the nozzle, changing the tips, just to bring it down a hair. Whereas this one is a little harder with the signature to actually get it up to the point where it sounds more balanced, because that bass is just really, really overwhelming the whole sound signature. So that is what I got on the CXS and the HM20. So thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.